Clint stopped mid-sentence, set the microphone down, and walked off stage. It was March 1986. The Directors Guild of America Awards at the Beverly Hilton. 300 filmmakers, producers, studio executives in black tie. Clint Eastwood was presenting the Lifetime Achievement Award to John Huston, the man who directed The Maltese Falcon, The African Queen, and had taught a generation what it meant to make films with integrity. Clint stood at the podium. He'd been speaking for maybe 90 seconds. His usual style, measured words, no flourishes, direct respect for a man who'd earned it. John Huston understood something most directors forget, Clint was saying, his voice carrying that familiar gravel tone. He understood that a film set isn't about the person in charge. It's about... He stopped. Not a pause for effect. Not a dramatic beat. He simply stopped speaking. His eyes shifted left. Toward the wings. Towards something happening in the backstage corridor that the audience couldn't see. 300 people in formal wear sat in silence, confused. The teleprompter kept scrolling. The director in the truck was speaking frantically into headsets. What's happening? Is he okay? Do we cut away? Clint's hand moved to the microphone. He lifted it carefully from its stand, set it down on the wooden podium with deliberate precision, and stepped back. Then he walked off stage. Left side. Into the wings. No explanation. No gesture to the audience. Just gone. Clint didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. What Clint saw from the podium was this. In the backstage corridor, 20 feet from the wings, an elderly man in a wheelchair sat alone. He was wearing a tuxedo that looked like it had been pulled from storage, slightly too large now, the bow tie crooked. His hands trembled slightly on the armrests. His eyes were closed. The man was John Huston, 79 years old. Emphysema ravaging his lungs. He'd been brought in through the service entrance because the front stairs were impossible for the wheelchair. He was supposed to be escorted to a backstage holding area where he could watch Clint's speech on a monitor, then be brought on stage when his name was called. But the assistant assigned to him had been pulled away to deal with some crisis involving a presenter's missing trophy. And John Huston sat in that corridor. Alone. In a wheelchair. While 300 industry people sat in a ballroom 50 feet away preparing to honor him. Clint had seen it from the podium. Just a glimpse. An old man in a wheelchair in the shadows while spotlights shone on an empty stage. He'd stopped talking mid-sentence. Set down the microphone. And walked directly to John Huston. The backstage crew froze. Clint Eastwood wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to be on stage. Presenting. Following the script. This wasn't in the run-of show. Clint crouched down beside the wheelchair. Not kneeling. His knees wouldn't take that anymore, but low enough to be eye level with John Huston. "John," he said quietly. Huston's eyes opened. He looked at Clint for a long moment, trying to orient himself. "Clint? What aren't you supposed to be? You're sitting in a hallway." The young lady said she'd be right back. "I didn't want to be any trouble." Clint's jaw tightened. Not anger. Something colder. He stood up and turned to a nearby stagehand. "Where's the event coordinator?" I don't know, Mr. Eastwood. There was some issue with." "Find them. Now." The stagehand ran. Clint turned back to John Huston. "You ready to go on stage?" "I'm not sure I can manage it." "The breathing." Huston gestured vaguely at his chest. "You don't have to do anything. Just sit there. I'll do the rest." Clint moved behind the wheelchair and started pushing it toward the wings. 2 production assistants rushed over. "Mr. Eastwood, we can handle. Where were you 5 minutes ago?" They had no answer. Clint pushed John Huston to the edge of the wings. The stage manager appeared, headset askew, looking panicked. "Clint, we're live. The audience is... They can wait. The schedule. Doesn't matter." Clint positioned the wheelchair just off stage, where John Huston could see the podium, the audience, the lights. "You okay here for a minute?" Huston nodded, still looking dazed. Clint walked back onto the stage. The audience had been sitting in confused silence for nearly 3 minutes. Some were whispering to each other. Others stared at the empty podium. The network had cut to a commercial. Chaos in the control room. Clint returned to the podium, picked up the microphone, looked out at 300 faces. "As I was saying," he continued, his voice unchanged, as if he'd never left. "John Huston understood that a film set isn't about the person in charge. It's about everyone who shows up. The grips, the drivers, the assistants, the people you never see in the credits but who make everything possible. John spent 50 years making sure those people were treated with dignity." He paused. Let that word, dignity, hang in the air. "Which is why it's an honor to present him with this award." Clint looked toward the wings. "John, would you join us?" A stagehand began wheeling John Huston onto the stage. The audience rose to their feet. Applause built, not polite ceremony applause, but genuine, sustained applause from people who understood they were watching something real. Clint waited until the wheelchair was positioned beside the podium. He bent down and handed John Huston the Crystal Award. The old director's hands shook as he took it. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. The applause continued. Huston looked up at Clint, tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he mouthed. Clint nodded. Stepped back. Let John have the moment. He didn't try to share the spotlight. Didn't make a speech about what he'd just done. Just stood there, 3 feet back, while 300 people honored a man who deserved it. What the audience didn't know, what most people never learned, was what happened after the ceremony. Clint found the event coordinator in the backstage office. A young woman, maybe 28, holding a clipboard and looking like she wanted to disappear. He walked in. Closed the door behind him. "You left a 79-year-old man in a wheelchair sitting alone in a hallway," he said. His voice was quiet. Conversational. Far more frightening than if he'd shouted. "Mr. Eastwood, I'm so sorry, there was an issue with." "I don't want to hear about the issue. I want to hear what you're going to do differently." She stared at him, tears already forming. "John Huston has emphysema," Clint continued. "He can barely breathe. He got dressed up. Put on a tuxedo. Came to this event because it mattered to him. And you left him sitting in a hallway like a piece of furniture waiting to be moved. It won't happen again." "You're right. It won't." Clint reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. "You're going to call this number tomorrow. It's a production company I work with. You're going to tell them I sent you. You're going to learn how to run a set where everyone, and I mean everyone, is treated like they matter. And if you don't want to do that, you should find another industry." He set the card on her desk and walked out. The event coordinator, her name was Sarah Chin, did call that number. She spent the next 6 months working as a production assistant on Heartbreak Ridge, learning from the ground up how Clint Eastwood ran a set. She learned that he knew every crew member's name. That he never went over schedule because he respected people's time. That he said please and thank you to grips and caterers the same way he did to actors. 20 years later, Sarah Chin would be one of the most respected line producers in Hollywood. She'd credit that night at the DGA Awards as the moment she learned what real leadership looked like. Away from the cameras, Clint made a choice no one expected. John Huston died 11 months later, in August 1987. Clint was one of the pallbearers at his funeral. At the reception afterward, Huston's daughter Angelica approached Clint. "Thank you," she said, "for that night at the DGA Awards. Dad told me what you did. How you found him in that hallway. Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said firmly. "They wouldn't have. Most people would have finished their speech. Let someone else deal with it. You stopped everything." Clint didn't respond to that. Just nodded. Angelica handed him a small envelope. "Dad wanted you to have this. He wrote it the week before he died." Clint opened it later alone. Inside was a note in John Huston's shaky handwriting. "Clint, you stopped your speech and came to get me. Most men wouldn't have noticed. Most who noticed wouldn't have cared. Most who cared wouldn't have acted. You did all three. That's not being a tough guy. That's being a good man. There's a difference. Thank you for knowing it. John." Clint kept that note in his wallet for the next 23 years. He never showed it to anyone. Never mentioned it in interviews. It stayed private, between him and a man who taught him that making good films was important, but how you treated people while making them was everything. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, forever. In 1993, Clint was directing and starring in Unforgiven. There was a scene being shot in the rain, complicated setup, dozens of extras, expensive equipment. They were running behind schedule. The producers were pushing to keep shooting. Clint noticed one of the grips, a man in his 60s who'd been working 14-hour days, sitting on an equipment case looking pale and short of breath. Clint walked over. "You okay?" "Just tired, boss." "I'm fine. You're going to see a medic." "Right now." "Clint, we're in the middle of..." "I don't care. Sets shut down until you get checked out." The grip was having a mild heart attack. The medic called an ambulance. He survived because Clint had noticed, had cared, and had stopped production without hesitation. When reporters asked Clint about it later, he said, "We were making a movie about consequences. About what happens when you forget people are human." Seemed like a good time to remember that. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. That moment at the 1986 DGA Awards became legend among people who worked in Hollywood. Not because it was dramatic. Not because Clint made a scene or gave a speech about it. But because in an industry built on spectacle and ego and getting the shot no matter what, Clint Eastwood had stopped everything to make sure an old man in a wheelchair wasn't left alone in a hallway. It's the kind of story that doesn't make headlines. Doesn't win awards. Doesn't even get told very often, because the people who witnessed it understand that Clint wouldn't want it told. But it matters. Because real strength isn't loud. Real leadership doesn't need explanation. And real integrity shows up in the small moments, when nobody's watching. The microphone Clint set down that night sits in the Directors Guild archive. Beside it is a small placard with John Huston's note. Clint never made a public statement about what he did. Never sought credit. Never explained why he walked off stage mid-speech. He didn't need to. The people who mattered understood. The crew members who watched him stop production for a sick grip. The assistants who saw him learn their names. The directors who studied how he ran sets where respect wasn't optional. It was the foundation. Clint Eastwood didn't teach lessons by talking about them. He taught them by living them. One decision at a time. One person at a time. One moment when everyone else would have kept reading the script. And that's why the story endures. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. Years later, a film student asked Clint about that night during a masterclass at AFI. "Is it true you walked off stage at the DGA Awards in the middle of presenting?" Clint looked at the student for a long moment. "Yep." "Why?" "Saw something that needed fixing." "But you were mid-speech." In front of everyone. Clint's response was vintage Eastwood. No explanation, no justification, just 8 words that said everything. The speech could wait. John Huston couldn't. The room went silent. 100 aspiring filmmakers suddenly understanding what couldn't be taught in textbooks. That same year, Clint was asked by a major studio to direct a big-budget action film. The schedule was brutal, 6-day weeks, 18-hour days, shooting across multiple countries. The money was extraordinary. The kind of offer most directors dream about. Clint read the schedule. Looked at the executive across the desk. "You want me to work my crew like this? It's industry standard for this level of production." Clint slid the contract back across the desk. Find someone else. He walked out. Turned down $8 million because the schedule didn't respect the people who'd have to live it. That decision never made headlines. The trade papers never reported it. But every crew member who ever worked with Clint heard about it. And they understood what it meant. It meant that to Clint Eastwood, how you make something matters as much as what you make. That respecting someone's time, their health, their humanity isn't weakness, it's the bare minimum of professionalism. John Huston's daughter Angelica still tells the story of that night. She tells it to young directors, to studio executives, to anyone in the industry who'll listen. My father was dying, she says. He knew it. We knew it. That award ceremony was one of his last public appearances. And he almost spent it alone in a hallway because someone forgot he was a person, not just a name on a program. She pauses. Clint didn't forget. He never forgets. The note John Huston wrote to Clint, the one about knowing the difference between being a tough guy and being a good man, was buried with Clint's personal effects when he passed. But before that, he'd had it photographed and framed. It hung in his home office for decades. Not in a prominent place. Not where visitors would see it. But where he would see it every morning when he sat down to work. A reminder. Not of what he'd done, but of what mattered.